Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice. Thanks for joining us. Today's episode is on when bad things happen.
Have you ever had an unexpected outcome and been unable to stop thinking about it?
Do you go into shame, blame, and guilt when you think you may have made a mistake?
Have you tried to believe it will turn out better than you expect, but in the end, it turned out worse?
The intention of this episode is to empower you with tools to help you respond with more grace and ease in the face of adversity.
We hope you will leave with a better understanding of how shame, blame, guilt, and rumination make hard things harder.
We're going to start with an invitation to a moment for pausing. So if it's safe for you to do so, you may opt to close eyes, and if it's not, then please don't close your eyes. And inviting you to simply arrive in this moment, allowing the mind and the body to be here at the same place at the same time. Giving yourself permission to provide attention towards the words that we share in this episode.
So today's episode is inspired by my very frequent use of it might turn out better than you expect. And many physicians that I work with are always look for when it will turn out worse than we expect, or that we tend to catastrophize and focus on the negative. And I like to think that hope is, of course, choosing to believe that things might turn out better than you expect. And yet sometimes in life, they don't. Bad things happen. We are diagnosed with cancer. A partner loses their job. Banks collapse. Relationships crumble. Divorce happens. You may have an unexpected outcome or what you might perceive as a bad outcome. You might get sued for a patient outcome, whether or not you made a mistake. You might even perceive that you made a mistake. And so in this podcast, we want to talk about what happens when things turn out worse than you expect or when bad things happen. So, Ni-Cheng, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what you do habitually when bad things happen.
The catastrophizing and the blame, shame, and guilt definitely still arise for me, despite a decade and more of practicing mindfulness. And I think it just speaks to the fact about how we are ingrained as human beings, especially as healthcare professionals, to go towards these very natural human emotions. And also that we can challenge the culture of medicine when outcomes go unexpectedly. We'll talk more about the experience of these morbidity and mortality conferences and these different organized ways of evaluating and shedding some light on bad outcomes in medicine, and how there's an over identification of those sessions becoming somehow intertwined with our worth as human beings, as healers, which can be really difficult to separate for many of us.
And the reason I asked that question is I just wanted to normalize for our listeners that no matter how much mindfulness and coaching we have done, our default is to go into panic when something unexpected happens. When even, in peds, if one of our patients is seen in the ER and is diagnosed with cancer, for example, you always go back to the chart to see what you missed, even though you may not have seen them for 6 months. And when you are in a sentinel event or difficult delivery or something like that, our natural tendency is to go into blame, shame, and guilt. And our natural tendency is to feel terrible and ruminate and really struggle to let it go. And so before coaching and mindfulness, I did a lot more of that. And I want to normalize that any physician who's ever practiced in medicine has had unexpected outcomes and had bad things happen to patients, because that's actually life and normal and expected. And what we can learn through neuroscience and coaching and mindfulness is how our natural reactions actually make hard things harder. And when we can pause and decide how we want to move forward, in that pause is where our power and control are. And that's where we can decide how we want to move forward. And then the added piece that you just mentioned is how the culture of medicine handles it. And so we were all taught to go into this blame, shame, and guilt. And medicine is set up for these sentinel event meetings and peer reviews and M&M, and those are designed under the guise of making the systems better and preventing something harmful in the future, really set up to find blame. And while they are disguised as looking for improvements, they have a huge cost on doctors. And I just wanted to have a bit of a conversation during this podcast before we get to the things that we can do as individuals to reflect on that and have people understand a little bit more about how those work. And the one thing I want to say that I've only discovered recently is that many of those things were not set up for physicians. I always believed that they were a physician thing and they came from the intent of improving care. If you look at it, they're actually to protect hospitals. And so I think it's really important that we as physicians understand that they're not about us and they're not about our care. They are really designed for institutions and set up in ways to protect institutions. And I have also heard recently that they are definitely not designed to protect the individual physicians, and physicians have had difficult things happen as a result of them. And so just to be aware of that and to have compassion for yourself in those moments. I'm curious, Ni-Cheng, what your thoughts on M&M or peer review or whatever you want to, whatever your hospital calls it.
Yeah, so I've been tasked before with organizing M&M conferences, and then also just to normalize, like, yes, I have been part of some, and it's definitely anxiety provoking to both organize and have to like approach the physician who's going to quote unquote be on the hot seat in presenting the case, and then having been the presenting physician. So basically, to have your clinical knowledge and your whole practice of medicine attributes that we as healers have worked so hard at to try to gain more experience and knowledge to help other human beings, but all of that becomes magnified and you're put under a spotlight with this magnifying glass, and then you have these peers asking you questions, at times disagreeing with you and sometimes voicing their opinions on what you should have done, is of course anxiety provoking. And of course, all of that evokes blame, shame, and guilt. And part of why it does that is that the peer review and the M&M format has been part of medical culture. And it's actually quite punitive, the way that it ends up playing out, like you said, under the guise of like patient care improvement. But the format, even in and of itself, is quite punitive of an experience.
Well, and
And
they
sometimes
give you a score, right? A score, many of them, P1, P2, P0, and you have no control over that score, for example. And you're not even understanding, I think, when I have been in them, that that's what's happening. There isn't a lot of clear communication around it. The other thing I just wanted to bring up is this shame, blame, and guilt, reminding our listeners that we talk about often releases cortisol, norepinephrine, which impacts our learning and makes us feel stuck and gets us into our lizard brain, our not highest functioning brain. So of course we go to default reactions in that moment.
So the M&Ms and peer reviews can be, in their intent, educational. And they are a way in which to have a structured, organized format to review unintended adverse outcomes that occur. And to speak to your point, Jesse, that these M&M conferences are set up for really the hospital, like that they can tick off a checkbox that they're meeting something under some compliance. But like, yeah, in theory, this type of review of when adverse events happen to other human beings are helpful for safety and accountability. But for many of us, instead of having that intent highlighted, we equate that one adverse circumstance and then reliving that experience when it's presented, and then having that experience scrutinized to a lot of judgment. That can become over identified with our identity as a healer. And so I feel like this is a moment of opportunity where changing the culture surrounding peer reviews and M&Ms can potentially be helpful. And I want to offer up a possible alternative, safer, more compassionate format for open and non-punitive discussion of adverse outcomes. And that format can be found in shorts rounds. So a participant of shorts rounds taken right off of the shorts rounds website, this type of rounds, these are places where people who don't usually talk about the heart of the work are willing to share their vulnerability, to question themselves. And the program provides an opportunity for dialogue that doesn't really happen anywhere else in the hospital. And I want to highlight the fact that these shorts rounds are non-punitive. Many of our healthcare institutions don't have shorts rounds, unfortunately, and they still ascribe to what I'm going to call pretty archaic formats of M&Ms and peer reviews. But can they be framed in a way? Maybe the moderator starts off with a statement of compassion, of a reminder of common humanity that reiterates and normalizes adverse outcomes, that many healers experience adverse outcomes in their work, and that we believe that the healer who's about to present what happened did the best that they could at that time and with good intentions. Like, can we start off the session with reminding everyone of that?
And I know that many of our listeners are actually in charge of peer review or M&Ms in their department. And so could we use this podcast and this messaging to begin that change? One physician, one peer review at a time, even starting this conversation with acknowledging that no physician intends to do harm and that bad things happen, as you mentioned, and that I don't know a physician who wasn't there doing the best they could in the moment with the information they had. And perhaps even acknowledging that the purpose of this is more for the hospital than for the individual physician, and acknowledging what's actually happening. That at least makes it feel a bit more safe and brings compassion to our human experience. And so I think that's the perfect spot to pivot to what can we do as individuals to not make it worse for ourselves when bad things happen? So we came up with a list, and hoping that this list will give you each something that you can begin to practice, and maybe you will end up being able to practice all of it. But our number one tip is to honor your own humanity. Of course, you feel bad when something bad happens. And of course, your default reaction is going to be blame, shame, and guilt initially. And a reminder that that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It's what happens to humans when bad things happen.
And number two, in no particular order, is a message that we have highlighted time and time again in our podcasts, and that's getting help helps. So, thinking about what support systems you have in place, individually, system wide, also recognizing that there are anonymous support lines that are freely available, like the physician support line staffed by volunteer psychiatrists from around the United States. You can reach them at www.physiciansupportline.com. And then, in terms of your healthcare system, is there a peer support program? So, luckily, my healthcare system has one, and we can connect with another peer. Oftentimes, this peer is someone that we don't really know, and oftentimes, and also preferably, they are completely separate from the adverse outcome. So, this peer support person that you get connected with has been trained to help you debrief in a safe, compassionate way, especially taking action in reaching out to peer support can be especially helpful after an adverse outcome. So, other things are like, can you also go to a mentor, to a friend who might also be a healer? So, thinking about, especially ahead of time, what your supports are.
And how are you resourced, and connecting with how you are resourced rather than how you feel alone. What connections do you have? Adding in also that for some of our listeners won't be healers themselves, but bad things happen to all of us. And thinking, for example, with a cancer diagnosis or a divorce or a death in the family, the idea of getting help helps is still important. Getting help is a sign of strength. And we know that outcomes are improved, for example, when you're part of a support group, when you have a cancer diagnosis. And so finding connection and finding people and remembering that getting help is a sign of strength. And number three is our invitation to take a pause and taking time to heal. In the medical culture, we very often are asked to go right back to work when something difficult happens, or if you happen to be in the ER or labor and delivery, you're often the only person there, and you may have had a code and have to continue to care for patients overnight, or continue to work in that moment. But gifting yourself whenever possible and as soon as possible, respite and a pause and time to heal. It is inhuman to expect that we wouldn't need time to heal from traumatic, unexpected outcomes. And yet, most of us grew up in medicine not being gifted that time and being told that it was stronger to come back and continue working. And in my humble opinion, this is one of the reasons why so many people in healthcare are struggling with so much burnout, because we don't acknowledge our humanity and we don't acknowledge the human need to take time to process and recover from traumatic situations. And anytime there's an unexpected outcome that involves a human, that potentially involves a human life that didn't turn out the way you hoped, requires some amount of time to heal. And so it is not necessarily, should not necessarily be more valued to come back right away. And I would encourage all of you, when this happens, to insist on some time to pause and heal.
Number four, curiosity. What if that adverse outcome isn't as bad as I think? What if it wasn't your fault? Can you, without judgment, think about the natural courses of disease or diseases that were ailing the patient to begin with, and what you already did to help the situation, even if ultimately an adverse outcome occurred? So basically highlighting the fact that all of us have a negative attention bias, and we are going to stick and ruminate on negative events like Velcro, because that's the way that our brains are wired. But we can also choose to bring in, even in the face of adverse outcomes, aspects and attributes of positivity that we definitely still brought into the situation. And then next, number 5 is patience. So it's likely that there's already been an adverse outcome that has occurred some time ago in your life. Has there already been a time in the past where it did get better with time, where you're not ruminating as much about it, when the blame, shame, and guilt faded over time? So this is an opportunity for self-compassion and a reminder, especially if you give yourself some grace and seek out support, that it will get better. You will be okay. And it's normal and okay and often necessary to not be okay right now. And to have the patience with yourself to allow yourself to feel everything. And it definitely takes time to work through and process, but not resisting reality and giving yourself the patience and time to move through your felt experience of this difficulty is the healthiest way through.
Highlighting that we as physicians tend to lack patience and we tend to have a strong urgency bias. And so when something unexpected or adverse happens, we want to move through it as quickly as possible. And oftentimes that isn't the best course of action. And sometimes we go back to work, honestly, as a way to buffer, to distract ourselves from feeling. And then those suppressed feelings come up and cause us more harm and pain later. Number 6 is acceptance, and my favorite, accept and allow, accept and embrace. Essentially, stop resisting, relaxing in. When we do that, we don't make things worse. Accepting isn't condoning or saying you did everything perfectly. Accepting is just accepting what happens. And I would refer you back to our recent podcast on acceptance. Accepting that we do hard jobs, really hard jobs. Accepting that it's painful when unexpected and adverse things happen because we care so much and because we have so much empathy. And accepting that humans have complex bodies and we don't know everything. We can't control everything, but that accept and allows a ton of relief. You can accept and wish it hadn't happened. And so consciously making the choice not to resist the reality of the situation can soften and allow some relief already.
Number 7, non-judgment of yourself and your reaction or response, even if it includes ruminating. Inevitably in life, terrible things happen despite our strongest and good intentions.
Number 8, stepping out of blame, shame, and guilt with intention to whatever degree possible. There are likely many aspects of what happened that are not your fault. And there's likely nothing you could have done to stop it or prevent it entirely. Most of us have moments in our career when these things happen that deeply affect us, but it does not mean that we were responsible, that we are to blame. And holding on to blame, shame, and guilt keeps us from learning and growing from the experience. And it keeps us from showing up as our best self for ourselves and for our future patients. Number 8 is self-compassion, and I would offer that we need self-compassion about our tendency to go into blame, shame, and guilt. But I also love Shauna Shapiro's definition of self-compassion. Many people I work with feel like self-compassion in the face of an adverse or unexpected outcome is a pass and it's complacent. But what she says is that self-compassion provides us with the life raft we need to navigate through tough times. By deepening self-compassion, we discover untapped reserves of strength and resilience and wisdom that help us survive the storm, and we strengthen our resources to better navigate future storms. And I can't think of a better tool to practice in these moments, recognizing that it takes practice. We have all been practicing blame, shame, and guilt, but we can commit from here forth to practice more self-compassion so that we can better navigate future storms. And I invite you to ask yourself, what would grace and compassion do for yourself, for your patients, and for your colleagues in these moments?
Self-compassion is an opportunity for self-kindness. And I'm going to share 2 quotes by Kristen F. Compassion is simply a kind, friendly presence in the face of what's difficult. Painful feelings are, by their very nature, temporary. They will weaken over time as long as we don't prolong or amplify them through resistance or avoidance. The only way to eventually free ourselves from debilitating pain, therefore, is to be with it as it is. The only way out is through. So compassion ultimately allows us to be with both the good and the difficult and everything in between. And it allows us to approach life by turning toward it, not away from it, with our palms wide open. When we turn towards life, including what's difficult, we can use that as an opportunity to be informed by each new moment as non-judgmental data. When we approach each moment with curiosity, we can choose with intention our response. And we hope that that includes a self-compassionate response.
And I wanted to share a few words as we continue forth with our recommendations that women physician colleagues shared when I posted, actually a few years ago, I was giving a session for the Stanford Fellows about unexpected outcomes and what recommendations attending physicians had for handling unexpected outcomes. And one physician said specifically, I have learned that beating myself up doesn't get me the results I thought it would. I used to believe that if I made a mistake, beating myself up would prevent another error. Now I know all it creates is more pain and no meaningful action. I call this instrumental self-compassion. I will be kind to myself because it frees up my energy to help others. I also love, I did the best I could in the moment with the knowledge and awareness that I had at that time, even if that time was an hour ago, a week ago, or a year ago. I can now choose to learn from it and apply that new knowledge to where I am now. When I remind myself that I'm truly doing my best, not someone else's best, but my best, I am also open to learning. And one more that I think is relevant here, and sharing the words of different physicians to also normalize the situation, the universality of the human experience, and to help you see that these tools that we're mentioning are actually helpful to actual physicians in actual situations. Another one says that physicians have trained and perfected the neural circuitry for being hard on ourselves. Data shows it's hard to undo, but it can be done. And that is what we are working to do here in this podcast. And this physician recommends speaking as kindly to yourself as you would to a colleague or friend about the same situation. What would you tell others? That's okay. These things happen. It happens to all of us sometime. You are human and you did your best.
And that highlights and exemplifies a quote from Kristen Neff: "With self compassion, we give ourselves the same kindness and care we'd give to a good friend."
Suggestion number 10 is to remember that we cannot learn without failure. In medicine, we were taught that mistakes can be dangerous and failure is unacceptable. And yet, in reality, we learn from failure, we grow from failure. And in most other industries, failure is seen as progress, and it's figuring out what doesn't work. And again, some words from colleagues about thinking about how to handle uncertain and adverse outcomes. Once I saw a therapist who jolted me when she said, "Do you think of yourself so highly that you need to be perfect?" I was pissed because the opposite thought usually runs through my subconscious. What if I don't know enough? What if I screw up? What if I don't know what to do? And this invitation that we probably shouldn't think of ourselves so highly that we could actually be perfect. Again, that's not human to be perfect.
Number 11, remember you're not alone. Healers try to heal others, and sometimes natural disease processes overcome all of the interventions that modern medicine offers. This is a fact that we can't change. And one last quote from Kristen Neff is that our successes and failures come and go. They neither define us nor do they determine our worthiness. And I wanted to close with the mindful self-compassion curriculum's equanimity phrase. Perhaps this is a phrase that you might remember in times of difficulty when, and especially when adverse outcomes happen. Everyone is on their own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it entirely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish I could. Moments like these can be difficult to bear, yet I may still try to help if I can. So at this time, we usually invite some reflection questions. And because these reflection questions are so much so that they can be part of a mindful moment, we've decided to embed the mindful moment as the reflection questions right here, right now, as opposed to the end of the podcast like we usually do. So, this mindful moment with reflection questions might be helpful with eyes closed or with a journal and pen in hand, or both. In some respects, you can do this practice over and over again with different circumstances in whichever way you feel it might serve you best. So, giving yourself a moment to settle, allowing the mind and the body to come back right here, right now, in the same place and same time. Can you recount a time when something bad happened? And as you're recounting this, what body sensations and emotions are arising for you? Can you recount what you did well in that difficult situation? And can you bring in a moment of self compassion, asking yourself, how can I give myself the kindness that I need in this moment? Maybe it's an opportunity for placing your hands atop your heart, or reminding yourself of that equanimity phrase. And just having gone through that brief exercise, what are you noticing now?
So if you enjoyed that exercise, that is what our mindful moments are like. And we encourage you in most of our podcasts, the mindful moment is after the bell. And we encourage you to stay on and enjoy them. They are a free offering that we put out there. And instead of going to Headspace or Calm, they're a quick, easy way to practice mindfulness with Ni Chang and I. So we hope you'll join us. We put effort into them. They're a bit of a passion project, and we hope that they get shared near and far. And if today's podcast spoke to you, we encourage you to work with us. You can work with us one-on-one on coaching or developing a mindfulness practice, or join us for a retreat. You can join us for Connect in Nature this upcoming September to build what I would call an overflowing toolbox of resources for if, or I should say when, bad things happen. If you don't want to wait till September, you can join me for a Sagrada retreat beforehand. And those retreats also empower you with an overflowing box of resources. And I would encourage you actually that you can join both. I have many people who have come to both of those retreats and the Honoring Diastole retreat because they are all different and all empower you with different tools. And the work that we do in medicine is hard, and it absolutely doesn't need to be made any harder.
We invite you to listen to our over 170 other podcast episodes at the time of this recording. Please share the Mindful Healers podcast with your colleagues and think about asking one of us or both of us to speak at your institution. Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of